Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today we raise a simple, explicit but blunt question. Does the recently unsealed superseding indictment in the United States reveal a smoking gun pointing straight at the collective face of the Modi government? Joining me for today's discussion is a senior advisor in the South Asia program at the United States Institute of Peace, Daniel Markey. Daniel Markey, before I come to details, let me ask you for your overall opinion. After the Financial Times first broke the story, a lot more detail of the allegation that the Indian government is involved in trying to kill a US citizen on US soil has been released in the superseding indictment. So let me first ask, how bad does it look for the Modi government?
Honestly, it looks pretty bad, maybe very bad. You have a story here which has clearly gotten the attention of the senior-most officials, national security officials in the US government, who have repeatedly approached the Indian government to share their concerns. And you have, it seems, an Indian government that is responding differently to this latest turn of the story than it did to the Canada incident. And so it seems that both sides appreciate the seriousness of the moment, but finding a way out of this could be incredibly difficult. And so, yeah, this is a tough one for the Modi government.
Let me explore your answer by coming to details at this point. The superseding indictment says that the assassination attempt was initiated by someone referred to as CC1. The indictment says he is an identified Indian government agency employee who has variously described himself as a senior field officer with responsibilities in security management and intelligence, and who also previously served in India's Central Reserve Police Force. Perhaps more importantly, the indictment says CC1 was employed at all times relevant to this indictment by the Indian government, resides in India, and directed the assassination plot from India. As you read that, does this suggest that the Indian government itself is behind CC1, or could CC1 be a rogue actor?
This absolutely suggests that CC1 is a part of the Indian government, as it says, has been employed within the Indian government, continued to be employed throughout the duration of the activities that are described. And there's every reason to think that this individual is probably a part of Indian intelligence. We have some other news about what it appears to be station chiefs, raw station chiefs that have been effectively asked to leave from San Francisco, from London, and that we don't have one in Washington, D.C. right now. This suggests that at least Washington and its allies are sending a message that they believe that this is a problem that goes directly to the heart of the Indian Intelligence Service. Now, how far it goes beyond that is still very much an open question. But no, it's hard to imagine this being a rogue actor.
If I heard you correctly, you're saying raw station chiefs were asked to leave from Washington, from London, and I know that someone was asked to leave similarly from Canada. So 3 raw station chiefs in 3 Western countries have been asked to leave in the recent past.
It appears that way, yeah.
Now, the indictment says CC1 recruited someone called Nikhil Gupta, who the indictment calls an international narcotics trafficker, who faced criminal charges in Gujarat, which CC1 said would be dismissed if the murder was arranged. Now, Gujarat, as you know, is the state Prime Minister Modi ruled for 13 years as Chief Minister till 2014. It's also where the Home Minister of India comes from. In Indian eyes, this will seem suggestive, if not suspicious. How is this viewed in America?
Well, I think for those who are following this closely, they'll have similar concerns. But I think that there will be no desire, certainly within the Biden administration or other parts of the US government, to jump the gun to make assumptions that would necessarily link these activities directly to the prime minister or the home minister. The question still, as I said before, is yes, this appears to be a problem within Indian intelligence. Just how far this goes, the knowledge that senior-most Indian officials had of these operations is entirely unclear. And it's not clear from what has been released in the indictment. One can make all kinds of assumptions, but I think we need to be careful about that.
So if I read what you're saying properly, you believe that the connection to Indian intelligence is fairly well established by the indictment. What we don't know is how much further up the political chain it goes.
Absolutely right, yeah.
Now, this gentleman, Nikhil Gupta, proceeded to contact one of his criminal associates, who in turn put him in touch with an alleged contract killer. The superseding indictment calls the man a hitman. But it turns out that the criminal associate, was an informant of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the second, the contract killer, was an undercover officer. Does this suggest that the DEA was tracking Gupta and therefore presumably knows quite a lot about him and his background and his activities, perhaps far more than they've revealed in the indictment?
Yeah, it's funny. That's the question relates. It's exactly what I was thinking when I read it. The extent to which the DEA, U.S. officials must have been tracking this Gupta ahead of time, because that meant they had to have put in place their informant, who would have been his contact to reach out to try to conduct this hit. So this all had to have been pretty well tracked for at least some time before he actually took any action. So, I think it's reasonable to assume that not only did they know of Gupta in the context of these activities, but they were probably concerned about what he had been doing otherwise, and perhaps they had picked up on other connections he had back to India. But that is speculative. Obviously, DEA is not going to tell us everything about the methods that they used to track him and to determine that he was up to something.
But this then presumably creates a piquant problem for the Indian government, because when they respond to the indictment, they would have to do so with the knowledge at the back of their mind that the DEA probably knows a lot more than it's revealed, and they have to be careful about what they say because they don't want to end up conflicting with what they still haven't been told.
Yeah, I think we should be careful here to recognize that, of course, there's the DA, there's the legal process that's associated with this indictment. There are all the individuals that are working on that. But there's also other parts of the U.S. intelligence community, and exactly who was collecting what and feeding into this process is, to me, at this moment, quite unclear. And it has to be, I think, somewhat unclear to the Indian government as well. So yes, the problem that you've identified is real. Precisely who knows what in the US system, and who would reveal what to their Indian counterparts, and who would do what publicly, that's much more of an open question. So we don't know exactly how the US government will handle this. And of course, there are sensitivities here because clearly the US government is spying on a variety of individuals, but precisely who does what and how they do it is something that they're not eager to make public. and they don't even want to share with other countries.
Very quickly, that answer would, of course, complicate matters even further for the Indian government, because they don't realize how many people know and what those how many people know.
I think that's right.
Now, let's come to another important detail from the indictment. It says, on the 18th of June, the day Hardeep Singh Nijjar was assassinated in Canada, and now I'm quoting from the indictment, just hours after the Nijjar murder, CC1, the Indian government employee, sent Gupta a video clip that showed Nijjar's bloody body slumped in his vehicle. Some people say that this allegation is significant because it suggests that the US authorities have electronic evidence which directly ties the Indian government official to Nijjar's assassination. And if that is true, then it would also, I presume, in some way support Prime Minister Trudeau's allegations. Would you agree with that wider interpretation?
I would. I think that it's quite possible that, in fact, this is the smoking gun evidence that the Prime Minister had access to, was aware of, potentially, but probably for reasons having to do with this indictment, or conceivably with reasons having to do with not spoiling this indictment, he's been unable to share that to audiences in Canada or the rest of the world or with India, because he was waiting for this to be unsealed. And so it's, it does certainly back his position very firmly. It also helps to explain the reticence that he has had. He can say general things about what Canada believes it knows, but hasn't been able to come out publicly and get out ahead of this legal action.
This also suggests that as far as the dispute between India and Canada is concerned, this puts the boot on the Canadian foot, not on the Indian.
I would agree with that.
Now, the indictment says, and again, I'm quoting from the indictment, over the ensuing weeks, Gupta engaged in a series of electronic and recorded communications with the criminal associate and later with the hitman, including by phone, video, and text message. These communications were encrypted but intercepted by the US authorities. Does this again suggest that they have a wealth of detail which may not have been made public? And I now know from the timelines that they were intercepting communication from the very early part of May right up till the end of June.
Yeah, again, the only point here I'd make is to distinguish potentially between who the they is who are intercepting these messages. It's possible that there was a kind of a sharing of intelligence between various parts of the US government. And here, I'm speculating because I don't know the particulars, but I think we need to be careful. There may be a limited amount of additional information available to the DEA and to legal parts of the legal team that are working this case, but there may be considerably more information available to parts of the US intelligence community, and that may or may not ever be made public through this process.
Two more questions, Daniel Markey, about the indictment before I move and talk to you about the United States government's response. First of all, the indictment makes clear that CC1 was prepared to pay as much as $150,000. In the end, the agreed fee was $100,000 and the advance paid was $15,000. Those are fairly sizable sums of money. Would a rogue actor, without the support of his government, be able to afford such large sums of money? Or does that suggest, once again, this is much more likely to be someone acting on behalf of his rather wealthy government?
Well, look, there are all kinds of rogue actors. Some of them have access to tremendous amounts of money. And so I'm not sure that the sum of money is in itself determinative. And the definition of rogue, of course, can be a bit open. That is, you can have completely rogue, that is operating outside the bounds of the government entirely. You can have rogue agents within the government who are, again, reporting to others and doing the work at others' behest. Maybe others who are semi-official or have ties to the government but aren't actually government. And in those cases, they may have access to considerable resources that are not actually government resources. So I'm not eager to get into speculating on precisely whether the money trail tells us much. But an individual actor would have trouble maybe in India coming up with that kind of cash. I wouldn't want to pursue that too far.
And I presume, talking about the category of rogue actors that there can be, that there is a third category too. A rogue actor that actually pretends to be a rogue actor to defend and cover up for his government, but is not a rogue actor.
Right. Well, deniability is actually a critical part of effectively trying to carry out such operations. And certainly as the Indian government attempts to come up with ways to respond to this, one of the questions will be, can they plausibly deny their connections? And if they put this off onto an individual or a small group of rogues within the system, that's one way that historically, not necessarily India, but other intelligence services have attempted to plausibly deny their involvement and ward off outside pressure. So here I'm thinking of Pakistan has done this repeatedly, claiming that it wasn't actual government responsibility. Frankly, it's been a reasonably successful and effective strategy, but it doesn't remove the suspicion that everyone, not just India, but everyone has about ISI responsibility for all sorts of activities outside of Pakistan.
All I'll do is to flag for the audience that if the situation is akin to that in Pakistan, that there is a small group of rogue actors within the Indian system that are acting independently of the government, that does raise disturbing questions about the Indian system, but let's leave that for another day, just as the ISI raises disturbing questions about the Pakistan system. Let me come back to the indictment. The indictment also says that at least 4 separate targets were discussed, one in New York, presumably Panun, another in California, and 3 in Canada. And at another point in the indictment, Nikhil Gupta says, and I'm quoting, "We will give every month 2-3 jobs." That is an enormous number of hits and people to kill every single month. So this looks not like a one-off, but the first step in what I suppose you could call a campaign of assassinations.
That's absolutely right. It's very disturbing. Maybe if you're looking for a silver lining, it would be that this suggests that this was the beginning of such a campaign and not in the middle of such a campaign. One could imagine that this was only maybe foiled somewhere in the middle. But to that point, we do have questions. This raises questions about the extent to which these killings may in fact be linked to other alleged Indian operations, including in the UK. We don't have strong evidence on that, but there was at least one individual who died in the hospital there. And of course, the Pakistanis have been yelling for some time about alleged Indian hit campaigns inside of Pakistan. So, the question here is whether this was basically taking a campaign that was already ongoing in other countries and bringing it to North America. But in any event, the answer to your question is yes, it's concerning, because it seems like it was just the beginning of something.
Once again, without raising the issue as a question, I'll point out for the audience that very recently the website Intercept, of which many people do have questions to ask, but has actually raised questions about whether certain mysterious deaths, quite a few of them in Pakistan, are somehow connected to people in India. They're relying on Pakistani intelligence, which India, of course, would question again. But nonetheless, for the sake of the audience, I mentioned that that is also there in the public domain. What the audience makes of it is something I leave to them. Let's now, at this point, Daniel Markey, come to the United States government's response. The Washington Post reports that Jack Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, raised this with his counterpart Ajit Doval in August. A week later, William Burns, the head of CIA, flew to India to talk to the head of RNAW. President Biden raised it with Mr. Modi at the G20 in September in India. Blinken and Sullivan raised it again with Jaishankar when he visited Washington at the end of September. And finally, Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, flew to India in October to once again give further details. The Post also says that Sullivan told Doval, and I'm quoting, "The United States needs an assurance that this would not happen again." How seriously does all of that suggest the US has taken this?
It couldn't be more serious. A couple of observations here. One is it's hard to imagine that the sourcing of the Post is not legitimate. And in that event, it also sounds, if we're getting direct quotes from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, that Jake Sullivan is confirming this with the Washington Post, or at least someone very close to the White House has shared this. And so I think we have to take it very seriously. But another point that I would make is that all of this outreach that was done by senior US officials to India, including the president himself, raising this with the prime minister, all of this was done prior to the unsealing of this indictment, which suggests that every attempt is being made to help the Indian government get out ahead of this story. In other words, these were certainly raising of concerns, but done in the most friendly way. Had India been an adversary of the United States, or a kind of a competitor, even in the category of China, one could imagine that all of this would be done, this airing of dirty laundry might have been done more out in public. But in this case, the questions have been raised repeatedly over months, with hope, I think, that India would take steps to address the problem before this indictment became public news.
Can I pick up on that point? If all these interventions at various levels and at various times by the United States government happened ahead of the unsealing of the indictment, now that the indictment has been unsealed and its details are known, would the concerns in Washington be greater?
Well, yes. I think this will bring it into the place of public politics in a way that it was not up until this point. So, as I say, I think the Biden administration was trying to give the Modi government plenty of space to operate for months now to come up with a way to manage this story. But the indictment would eventually get unsealed. I mean, I think it's important for audiences to recognize the Biden administration does not control this legal process. This was moving at its own pace. Neither, coming back to the Prime Minister of Canada, of course, he has no control over this process. So when he made the comments that he did, but was unable to back them up with some of this evidence that we now have, it's partially because he has no window, no control, no say over how the legal process in the United States works. But then coming back to the Biden administration, you know, the big hope here was that they would find a way out of this mess, is my sense, and they haven't. And now they have to be more worried that it will take on a life of its own.
There's something inherent in your answer, which is a point I'd like to tease out further and clarify. If the Biden administration was giving the Indian government ample opportunity to respond properly, adequately, and resolve this matter, and clearly that hasn't happened, I imagine the Biden administration is disappointed with the Indian response. They gave them a chance to resolve it, and the Indians didn't take it.
I think you're right. I think that, you know, we should get into this, but I think that this will cut in certain U.S. policymaking circles. This will suggest that there should be less trust for their Indian counterparts, and will raise concerns about just how serious India takes the relationship with the United States and how effective India is at managing these kinds of problems within its own system. So it raises a lot of questions.
Let's then come to the impact that this will have on Indo-US relations. First, their strategic closeness is based upon their shared interests and America's keenness to deepen ties with India as a counterweight to China. To what extent will those strategic interests be adversely affected by this development?
Well, it's conceivable that this would be a kind of a manageable blip in the relationship. I'm not betting on that, but it is possible that the Indian government will now, faced with this public allegations, will come forward and will more effectively manage it. They've announced this plan for some kind of a investigation. They will come forward, as we've already discussed, with some steps against individuals that will bring about a sense of plausible deniability. And then the two sides, recognizing that their strategic interests lie in cooperation, particularly with respect to the challenge they face, the broader strategic challenge they face from China, will more or less get back to business. There will be continued kind kind of concern, certainly within the U.S. intelligence community, about what India may be up to. And there may be a kind of a lingering set of doubts about just how trustworthy, as I say, India is likely to be. And some of that, frankly, I think would be healthy. I think would be a certain realism, an injection of realism into the American policymaking circles that maybe should have been there already.
Let me take up that last point. The two countries also claim that they share values, something that you told me in our last interview simply isn't true. It's just rhetoric. Have these developments blown that belief, or maybe I should say that myth, clean out of the water?
I would hope that they continue, that this is a warning, this is an alarm, that this is the kind of thing that U.S. policymakers, senior and mid-level and even junior, would begin to factor into their calculations as they work with this government in India. It is not, doesn't end the broader hope and aspiration that India, as a fellow democracy, ought to have a certain type of behavior and worldview. It won't completely end that, nor necessarily should it entirely. That is an aspiration. But I think it will inject, as I said before, a greater realism and pragmatism, and maybe distrust, certainly in the U.S. intelligence community, for India, which some healthy distrust probably should have been there already.
What would be the impact on Congress, where critical defense deals to do with drones, to do with jet fighter engines, are still awaiting clearance? They were the high point of the visit that Modi made in June. Is there now a possibility that that clearance could face serious hurdles?
Well, there was always the possibility that there would be individual members of Congress who, for various reasons having to do with their own political constituencies or some broader strategic or democracy-related concerns, would have and have raised questions about the administration's policy. This will give more ammunition to those groups within Congress. What's less clear to me is whether the broader politics have really shifted. I mean, there is a broad and bipartisan consensus here in the United States that favors closer ties with India. And going up against that consensus has political costs. There are, this has direct consequences for elections here. There's no desire to upset the Indian community within the United States, the Indian American community. And there are all kinds of benefits or presumed benefits of closer commercial and defense ties with India. So there's a lot of money to be made. There are a lot of votes to be won. There's a lot of benefits to a positive and close, warm relationship with India. So not all of that will be thrown out the window on the basis of this, but a kind of a steady underlying drumbeat of concern within Congress will be growing. And this will be a part of it. And I have no doubt that we'll be seeing letters from individual senators and congressmen asking the administration for more information, as they do, possibly holding hearings about this issue in particular, and raising questions, certainly uncomfortable questions for Indian diplomats and the Indian embassy here in Washington. They will be on the hot seat for some time to come.
You talked about holding hearings. Today's Hindustan Times reports that, in fact, Congress does plan, I think it's the House of Representatives, to hold fairly urgent hearings on what is called transnational repression, and that is clearly linked to what is now alleged about India's involvement killing or attempting to kill US citizens in the United States. When those hearings begin, will that be an embarrassing moment for India and for the Indian embassy in particular?
I think it will be a difficult moment. I think it will be the kind of moment that India has been working very hard to avoid and has successfully pushed off, more or less, in terms of congressional activities for quite some time. And I'll just remember early, now 20 years ago, when I was just coming to Washington, India was routinely being subjected to uncomfortable questions on Capitol Hill. At that time, it had a lot to do with Kashmir. And this drove the Indian embassy nuts. They were very eager to quash these kinds of conversations, or at least to change the tone and tenor of them. India has been very successful in kind of pushing back on that kind of narrative, and that it's making a return to Congress in the form of these hearings will be unwelcome, certainly with the embassy, and will create headaches.
Finally, what about the impact on the American media? I noticed that an article in the New York Times yesterday, the 30th, included India in a group which was described as, and I'm quoting, deeply imperfect allies. Unlike India, in the United States, the administration cares an awful lot about what the media says and thinks. So how do you think the media collectively will swing on this one?
Well, it's getting a fair amount of attention, but I should qualify that by recognizing that other stories are really dominating the space, the international news space. Certainly, the Israel-Gaza story right now is kind of creating a deafening din. It's hard for any other news to get through. So the American media will always be easily distracted and have a hard time focusing on more than one thing at a time. But we'll continue to plug away at this story, no doubt. And, some of the bits and pieces that we're reading in the press are the result of reporting, not just this from this unsealing of the indictment. And that will continue to come. So the drip, drip, drip on this story is the kind of thing that I think we can trust that investigative reporters in Washington and elsewhere in the States will be pursuing. And it will affect, as I say, the broader narrative about India. As you pointed out, whether India is a trustworthy partner of the United States, that will be more in question. And I think those questions will come with relatively uncomfortable answers, and India will be less and less grouped, as it has been, say, with Quad partners like Japan and Australia, and increasingly grouped with frustrating partners like Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, or Erdogan, less and less democratic partner, but a NATO ally in Turkey. It's important for Americans, I think, to appreciate that we have all kinds of partners, allies, and so on, and India hopefully can find a useful place, a constructive place within that spectrum, but we shouldn't put it in the wrong spot. I think for a while now, the tendency has been to put India in with, say, the UK, France, other allies, and I think that will shift.
Now, as you said earlier, the American government was hoping that the Indian response would be such that this matter would be resolved before the indictment was unsealed. That didn't happen. The indictment has been unsealed. What response now do you think the Biden administration is looking for from the Modi government? On Wednesday evening, India said it has constituted, and I'm quoting their statement, a high-level inquiry committee to look into all the relevant aspects of the matter. Government of India will take necessary follow-up action based on the findings of the inquiry committee. Do you think that would be sufficient for Washington, or would they want more?
Well, the committee itself is insufficient. If the findings are such that they deny or discount or reject the U.S. concerns, that will be insufficient. If the committee were to go so far as to identify individuals that were identified as rogues or acting without higher level authority and to take action against them, it's conceivable that that would be considered politically sufficient to satisfy the moment and would enable the Biden administration to get back to the business at hand, which was to cultivate a closer relationship with India and with the Modi government in particular. But that's not entirely clear. I mean, I think we have to stay tuned on that to see whether the Indian response can match those U.S. concerns and whether it's considered a plausible response. But the last point I would make here is, the United States has moved forward to work with other countries of strategic significance, even when it has deep and continuing concerns about the behavior of their leaders. And here I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia. So it is possible, we have every reason to believe that Saudi Arabia has conducted, horrific activities both at home and in the Khashoggi incident overseas. And yet the Biden administration has found itself making deals with Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia. So if we can do that, then I think the long-term question about India has to do with strategic interests, and we will find a way to do that. We will find a way to pursue those interests with India. But politically, this will be problematic. And in terms of the trust and good feelings and warmth and positivity in the relationship, this could come at a real cost.
Now, as you know, there is a moment in the indictment when Nikhil Gupta, sitting in Delhi in a conference room with 3 other people in the room with him, swivels his camera around because he's on a video call to show 3 gentlemen seated and dressed in what's called business attire. I take it at the very least, the American government will want to know who are these 3 gentlemen.
Absolutely. That of course is something that they'll want to know. It's conceivable they already know, and that what they'll want to know is what India is doing with those individuals. And beyond that, what India would do with respect to presumably a larger group, a more senior group, who would have been directing those individuals. So there are already some threads to pull for the US government in terms of actions that India would be expected to take. And that's just the beginning of it.
Now, if, as you repeatedly suggested in this interview, Washington is prepared for strategic reasons to overlook this, there are many former foreign secretaries in India who believe America will still want its pound of flesh. A, would you agree with that? And B, if you do you have any sense of what that pound might consist of?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting argument. I guess one thing that I would want to come back to in an answer to that is there are multiple processes at work here, and they're not all as intimately connected as that suggestion or that statement would suggest. So there's a legal process. The United States will be pursuing that. Individuals associated with that within the legal community and the prosecutor's office and so on in New York will be pursuing that. That's one set of ways that the United States will respond to this. There's an intelligence process, assuming, as I said before, that this is considered very much the work and associated with the work of individuals within the Indian Intelligence Service. There will be a response. And when you say a pound of flesh, there may be a kind of a tit for tat, not just the removal of raw chiefs from the United States, but there may be other restrictions or other responses to the Indian Intelligence Service that the United States will demand, partially because the United States is trying to work closely with Indian intelligence on other issues of common concern, particularly with respect to Chinese activities in South Asia and elsewhere. And so in order to kind of bring back a sense of trust in that intelligence to intelligence relationship, they'll want to make sure that their concerns have been adequately addressed. And then there's the policy and political response. And this is somewhat separate. This is, can the Biden administration be confident that the Modi government appreciates the political costs and risks that it has run by this type of behavior? And will the Biden administration feel that the Modi government has taken other steps to address that and to make this relationship even again, in a sense, to sort of pay back for the costs and trouble that it's clearly imposed on this? And that's a separate question. Maybe there's a pound of flesh there. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but obviously India taking additional steps to make it clear just how eager it is to work with the United States and to pursue other, say, defense ties or commercial ties would be the kind of thing that would give greater political ammunition to the Biden administration to push back on critics who will, as I said before, be with this have more reasons to question that relationship. So they'll need to be able to say to American critics, look, yes, that's a problem, but we have these other things that we're doing with India. They're equally and in fact much more important, and we're going to pursue those. So let's look at the positive side. That doesn't to me look like a pound of flesh, but definitely a smoothing of the relationship will be in order.
Would I be right in saying that till this matter is satisfactorily resolved, and particularly from the American point of view, there could be an adverse impact on intelligence sharing?
I think so. I think, there are different channels within intelligence sharing, and all of that is stovepiped, and for reasons of, trying to keep a handle on who knows what, intelligence sharing is not across the board. And with India, that's always been the case. But I think that would be one of the ways to deter such action in the future, is to suggest that there will be a cost to India's access to US-based intelligence if India is going to take steps like this going forward. So that'll be a real problem. There would also be, a political cost. My understanding is that the President Biden has been invited to Republic Day at the end of January. Let's wait and see whether he goes. I think that will be an interesting bellwether as to the nature of the relationship.
That was going to be my last question. As you know, to be invited for Republic Day as chief guest is a huge honor that India confers. It would be a huge thing for India as a country if President Biden came, and particularly for Prime Minister Modi, because next year is also election year for him. The invitation has been issued at least 2 or 2.5 months ago. We have less than 2 months for Republic Day, but the president hasn't answered. Do you think it's becoming unlikely, given what's happened, that he will accept?
I think this looks to me, again, speculative, but it looks to me like the reason why you haven't gotten a positive response. Because barring this set of events, the Biden administration has really taken tremendous pains to build a closer political relationship with Prime Minister Modi and with India generally. The state visit back in June was a major focal point for this administration, and all the way through, steps have been made both directly, bilaterally with India, and also through the Quad and other institutions, G20, to really reach out and do everything possible to advance that political and diplomatic relationship. And Biden sees it as a political winner, or has seen it as a political winner for him as well. This isn't just a matter of Modi going into an election year. Biden's going into an election year, and he wants to demonstrate that his outreach to India has been a major success in the category in his foreign policy agenda. He wants to show that he's done everything possible to advance that. And this assassination issue gets in the way of that narrative. And it really upsets what I think otherwise the Biden team would portray as a major victory in a foreign policy sense. And that's worrisome to them. So they'd like to get this back on the rails, but the facts may get in the way.
If in the end the president doesn't accept and doesn't come to India, what would the message be?
I think that they'll have an easy way out, which is effectively the State of the Union may overlap or otherwise complicate matters. I've read that that's one of the reasons that they so far have used for not accepting the offer. So there are always other reasons that the president may be unavailable for international travel, and they would probably resort to that.
Except the State of the Union did not deter Obama.
Well, the State of the Union doesn't have to get in the way, but there may be reasons why it would appear that would be impossible to get around.
But would it still indicate a sudden measure of displeasure if he doesn't?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would read it that way. That's why I say I think it should be seen as a bellwether for intentions going forward. And if he does not attend, it's conceivable that there would be some other reason, but I think this would have to be front and center.
Daniel Markey, thank you very much for this interview, and thank you very much for the time you've given me.
Of course, thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.